Windblown's fun. Here are some things I found out. First is how damage is generally calculated. Usually the damage of an attack is its base damage plus the base damage times the damage increase. Damage increase can include criticals, increased damage from boosts, or things like curse. This will make most forms of damage increase additive. So say you have something like plus 20% damage and then plus 20% crit damage. Since critical hits are plus 50% damage by default, the total extra damage would be 20% plus 20% plus 50% for 90% total. So something that normally does 10 damage will do 19 damage in this example. 10 for the base, plus 9 for all the extra damage, including the critical. This is important since most forms of damage increase would be diminishing returns over time. There are exceptions to this rule that make it multiplicative rather than additive. For example, a pretty well-known one is Echo, since it takes the final damage of your attack and just multiplies that by 105%. Another one is Hit Blast that just does extra damage depending on how much damage you deal. Since Hit Blast also hits the initial target, it makes it one of the best damage increasing gifts in the game. The biggest exception to the additive rule, however, is weapon level. The final damage of weapons and trinkets is multiplied depending on how high the weapon level is. This table shows from level 2 to level 7 how much extra damage it will do, with base being at level 1, 40% at level 2, and all the way up to 180% extra damage at level 7. Keep in mind that because weapon level does multiplicative extra damage, it's usually more effective to increase your weapon level than it is to increase things like damage. You can see that a level 7 weapon does almost 3 times as much damage as a base level weapon. Speaking of damage, let's talk about alter attack damage. Most people probably already know this, but an alter attack's damage is based partially off of the weapon that it's paired with. You can see this in the weapon's stats. So if this here says it does 20% damage, that's an extra 20% increase to the alter attack damage of the weapon it switches into. Generally, melee weapons with longer combo strings have a better alter attack damage stat. Just keep in mind that this will buff the damage of the weapon it switches into, not its own alter attack. Something else that's important to keep in mind is that alter attacks always deal critical hits. Because of this, the increased alter attack damage you see on the weapon stats aren't as effective as you would think. This is because all alter attacks are getting an extra 50% damage from the critical hits already. We can use the Beat Bolt as an example. I'll pair it with a level 1 boomerang since this actually does 0% extra damage on an alter attack. You can see that it does 180 damage. Because this is a critical hit, the base damage of this would have actually only been 120. If we pair the Beat Bolt with the kunai instead, which will add 40% damage on alter attacks, you can see it does 228 damage. We can get this number by taking the 120 damage of the base, plus the 50% crit, plus the 40% from the kunai. If the damage truly was multiplicative, it would be doing 252 damage instead of 228. This also applies to things like chained alter attacks. While a normal alter attack does increase damage just based off the stat of the weapon, the first chained alter attack will do an extra 50% on top of that, with the second one doing an extra 100% on top of that. However, once again, because the first alter attack's damage is actually being increased from the critical, the damage increase you're going to get isn't as high as you would think. If we look again at the Beat Bolt paired with the boomerang, remember that the alter attack will do 180 damage. However, the chained alter attacks only add an extra 60 damage per chain. It's 60 since it's an extra 50% of the base damage of the Beat Bolt's alter attack, which is 120, not 180. Finally, here's some random other things I noticed on other weapons. First, while the telepike says it does critical hits on the tip, it actually does critical hits plus 50%. This means that with no other damage modifiers, a hit at maximum range will deal double the damage as a normal hit. This also means, however, that things like increasing critical hit damage won't be as effective as you think. This is because the base damage of the telepike is only 15 per hit. So while a normal tipped hit does 30 damage, getting a boost like an extra 20% crit damage, for example, would only add 3 damage. One nice thing about the telepike is that its alter attack is generally a better version of the boomerang's alter attack. You might think this is wrong since the boomerang's alter attack does damage so quickly. However, the alter attack for the telepike deals 3 relatively high damaging hits at the very beginning of its attack. The damage for these hits is roughly equal to 3 normal hits of the telepike at maximum range, plus a little bit extra. So as long as you use the alter attack for the telepike at close range to an enemy, it will generally deal more damage than the boomerang's alter attack. If you start it far away from an enemy and then wander into its range, it won't deal nearly as much damage. Also, keep in mind that these 3 hits at the very beginning of the alter attack count as being hit at the tip. It doesn't matter if you do this from extremely close range. Any other hit besides these 3 initial hits will only get the extra tip damage if you're doing it at the right range. Finally, the last thing I noticed is that the Ninja Star's damage calculations seem pretty off. This is true whether you use it as a normal attack or you use this alter attack. For some reason, getting increased damage or doing things like extra chained alter attacks don't increase damage as much as it should. In fact, the amount of damage it increases it by is pretty pathetic. For example, if you look here, you can see that a critical hit does 40 damage per hit. However, if I use this run as an example where I have both Present Hex and Midas, for an extra 50% damage. A critical hit now does 44 damage. That's only 4 extra damage for what equals an extra 50% damage. I'm pretty sure the reason for this is that the base damage of a shuriken is actually the damage at the closest range possible. If the base damage of a shuriken is actually being calculated as 8, it would make sense that damage increases deal so little extra damage. So while effectively the shuriken's damage is pretty high, any damage increases you get to it will barely make any difference. I already reported this as a bug inside the game, so hopefully this will get changed eventually. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.